In the early hours of October the 14th, 1939, a massive explosion rocks British battleship the Royal Oak while safely at anchor in Scapa Flow. 835 sailors would perish when the 29,000-ton battleship rolled on its side before slipping beneath the surface. At first, no one suspected an enemy attack, but the discovery of a German torpedo days later would uncover the true nature of the disaster. This is the story of U-47 and her daring mission into Scapa Flow. In late 1939, Britain and France had declared war on Germany, and with Germany's powerful army sweeping across much of Eastern Europe, it would shortly turn its attention to France. As Britain was an island nation protected by a barrier of ocean, Germany hoped to cut off maritime trade routes and stop the supply of food and raw materials shipped in from the United States, and they hoped to starve Britain out of the war. Britain needed more than 1 million tons of imported food and material each week in order to survive and fight. If Germany's navy could cut off Britain's supply lines, Britain would have no choice but to agree to Germany's terms of surrender. Just like in the First World War, Britain organised its merchant ships into large convoys for the treacherous journey across the Atlantic, often escorted by a group of destroyers or corvettes for protection. The convoy system had proved useful in minimising merchant shipping losses to German submarines and battlecruisers. From day one of the war, Germany had nearly its entire navy stationed in the Atlantic, and enjoyed some early success, sinking thousands of tons of British food and raw materials by striking mostly unescorted merchant ships. The problem for Germany was, in 1939, Britain had the world's largest navy, and it was only a matter of time before this fact caught up to the German battlecruisers playing it fast and loose in the Atlantic. At the beginning of the war, the German Navy, known as the Kriegsmarine, had just 38 surface warships, while the British had a massive 272. These stats were not lost on the head of the German Kriegsmarine, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, who was under no illusions when it came to the discrepancy between the two forces. Raeder, who was somewhat blindsided by the sudden onset of the war, had been assured by Hitler that hostilities would not break out for a further 5 years, and he had envisioned using that time to build a powerful fleet to rival that of the British. He would say of his navy upon learning war had broken out, "The surface forces are so weak and so few in numbers in comparison to the British fleet that the only course open to them is to show that they know how to die gallantly." There was one man in the German Kriegsmarine who believed he knew how Germany could realistically defeat Britain at sea and starve her out of the war. That man was Admiral Karl Dönitz, a World War I U-boat commander and now the head of the Kriegsmarine U-boat arm. Dönitz seen no point in trying to match the British in surface warships. Instead, he wanted to build an enormous fleet of U-boat submarines to fill the Atlantic with an invisible threat that could easily strike merchant ships from below the waves, then slip away silently before being detected by British warships. With the Air Force and Army predominantly receiving most of Germany's attention and resources, Dönitz struggled to secure the necessary support and capital to ramp up U-boat production. An opportunity would present itself to Dönitz in October of 1939. A photograph taken over Scapa Flow from a German reconnaissance flight had shown a number of possible gaps in defences where a submarine could penetrate the harbour. Scapa Flow, located in the Orkney Islands in the north of Scotland, was the chief naval base for the British. It was a large body of water, with an area of more than 125 square miles and capable of housing the entire British Navy. It was sheltered by a series of islands and had 7 entry points into the harbour, each of which were blocked off by anti-submarine nets or obsolete ships that had been deliberately sunk to block any unwanted entry into the harbour. In short, Scapa Flow was a naval fortress, and the British considered it impregnable to submarines. However, pictures taken on the reconnaissance flight revealed there to be potential gaps in some of the eastern entry points. To Dönitz, this was the perfect opportunity. If a U-boat could sneak into Scapa Flow and wreak havoc on the British fleet, it would win the support of German war planners, therefore gaining the needed resource and capital to expand the U-boat fleet. Dönitz asked 31-year-old U-boat skipper Gunther Prien to undertake the daring mission. Prien and his crew aboard U-47 were somewhat rising stars already, having sunk 3 Allied merchant vessels in the first week of the war. Prien was Dönitz's favourite, and he said he possessed all the personal qualities and professional abilities required to perform such a dangerous mission. On the 8th of October 1939, Prien and his crew aboard U-47 departed Kiel for Orkney. They mostly travelled in the dark of night and spent much of the daylight hours lying silently on the ocean floor. They avoided all shipping, and the crew were not briefed until midway through the mission. This was, however, not the first time such a mission had been attempted. In World War I, 2 separate attempts were made to sneak into Scapa Flow by German U-boats. One ended with the crew forced to surface and taken captive. The other, the U-boat sunk with the loss of its crew. U-47 approached Orkney in the evening of October the 13th. They surfaced 4 hours sailing time from the British anchorage and mostly remained on the surface from then on. They approached the eastern channels of Scapa Flow and headed for Kirk Sound, where the most noticeable gaps and defences were. Kirk Sound was the perfect place to attempt entry. Unlike most of the other entry points into the anchorage, Kirk Sound didn't have lookout points and searchlights or shore-mounted machine guns protecting against any unwanted intrusion. Precise timing was essential to negotiate the strong tidal currents, but U-47 and a crew arrived at their planned entry point later than expected. As a consequence, they had to deal with a following tide. The strong currents pushed the U-boat into an anchor chain of one of the sunken block ships, requiring quick action and skillful manoeuvring to avoid the whole endeavour ending right there and then in spectacular failure. Prien and his crew were well aware this could be the last undertaking of their lives. If they were spotted, the shallow depths of Scapa Flow meant that there would be nowhere to hide. They would almost certainly be killed or captured. It was after midnight by the time they'd successfully gained access. Prien and his crew sailed stealthily into the southern end of the anchorage, deciding to remain on the surface throughout the entire operation. The crew searched patiently through their binoculars, but to their growing disappointment, they could not spot any large targets. Unbeknown to Prien and his crew, the British Navy, fearing an air raid may be imminent on Scapa Flow over the coming days, had ordered its capital ships to move to other ports as a precaution. After a fruitless search in the south, U-47 spun around and began to move northwards up the coastline towards the northeastern corner, where reconnaissance photos had shown battleships were often at anchor. As it became apparent the anchorage was empty of warships, Prien and his crew began to realise their cunning endeavour might have been all for nothing. But just as they were about to turn around and head for the exit, the silhouette of a large battleship became visible in the distance. It was the 29,000-ton Royal Oak battleship, a veteran of World War I and participant in the Battle of Jutland, the largest surface naval clash in modern history. U-47 manoeuvred into position to make an attack on the Royal Oak, and at a distance of around 4,000 yards, Prien fired off a spread of 3 torpedoes before quickly turning to make an escape. 2 of the torpedoes missed, but the third clipped the bow of the mighty battleship. On board the Royal Oak, there was a dull thud and a muffled blast which confused the sailors on board. Most thought the cause of the explosion was an internal issue with the ship, and given they believed the anchorage was entirely secure, almost none suspected it to be an enemy attack. When Prien realised there was no defensive reaction to his attack, and seeing the damage to the battleship was minor, he turned U-47 back to the north and got into position to make another attack. This time he moved into 3,000 yards and fired 3 more torpedoes. At 1:06 AM, all 3 torpedoes hit the mighty battleship, and she immediately began to lisp to one side. All her lights went out as the power began to fail, and water poured in through the gaping holes in her side. Sailors asleep in their bunks were trapped below deck, and those that managed to escape found themselves in the freezing cold water. By 1:29 AM, the Royal Oak had slipped beneath the waves, causing the deaths of 835 British sailors out of the 1,290 aboard. U-47 quietly departed Scapa Flow the same way it had entered, and safely made it back to the German port of Wilhelmshaven 3 days later. Upon arrival back in Germany, Prien and his crew were immediately greeted as heroes. Each of U-47's crew were awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. Prien received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, the first submariner to receive the prestigious award. Admiral Karl Dönitz had successfully gained support for his U-boat expansion, and Germany would build more than 1,000 U-boats over the course of the war. Prien and his crew of U-47 would go on to complete a number of highly successful patrols in the Atlantic. However, on the 8th of March 1941, Prien and his crew were caught in an engagement with 2 British destroyers while attempting to harass a merchant convoy. U-47 spent 5 hours trying to escape the British warships. Running low on oxygen and battery, they were forced to surface, but immediately came under attack. Prien ordered the U-boat to once again dive, but they would be caught in a successful pattern of depth charges dropped from above. A large orange explosion visible from the surface would confirm the destruction of U-47 and her 45 crew. She would become one of the 632 U-boats sunk by the Allies during the course of the war.